You learned ballistics from a video game, sweetheart? Senior Chief Grant Maddox didn't whisper it. He turned to face his 13 operators and made sure every single man heard it clearly. The laughter came fast and loud, rolling across the firing line like a second wind. Mara Voss didn't look up from her notebook. Mac stepped closer. We don't need a weather girl telling us why we missed. She capped her pen, looked at him, then looked past him. 4,000 meters of desert, steel panel, 13 missed shots. Then stop missing, she said. Step aside and let me show you how it's done. The convoy arrived at Red Mesa Naval Test Range before sunup. 13 vehicles, 13 operators, gear cases that cost more than most people's cars, stacked in the back of 3 government trucks with the kind of casual confidence that only comes from knowing you are the best at what you do. Senior Chief Grant Maddox rode up front in the lead truck, one arm resting on the open window frame, watching the New Mexico desert turn from black to rust orange as the sun dragged itself up over the mesa. He was 44 years old, 19 years in naval special warfare. He had taken shots in conditions that would have made a physics professor weep. Crosswinds in Afghanistan, heat shimmer in Iraq, altitude and cold and fatigue stacked together in places that didn't appear on any map he was allowed to carry. He had buried 2 partners and carried a third off a mountain in the dark. He had never once been told by a civilian that he was reading the desert wrong. He was not planning to start today. Chief Owen Reddick rode in the second truck. He was 51, the oldest sniper on the team by 6 years, and he had spent the last 2 of those years quietly deciding that his knees were going to force the question his pride kept refusing to answer. He didn't talk much on convoy rides. He watched things the way light moved, the way terrain changed, the small details that younger operators stopped noticing after they got comfortable with being excellent. Owen Reddick had never gotten comfortable. He considered that his one genuine virtue. Project Far Horizon had been briefed to the team 4 days earlier. Classified exercise, not training, not a simulation, but a live data collection event tied directly to an upcoming hostage rescue operation in North Africa. Target was a steel communications panel, hardened, mounted on a reinforced frame, positioned 3,980 meters from the firing position at Red Mesa. The exercise was designed to test a new long-range observation and ballistic solution system before the real mission. If the system worked here, it would be trusted in the field. If the team could demonstrate consistent accuracy at the edge of the rifle's capability, the rescue operation would proceed with the data they needed. If they couldn't, 12 American contractors and 2 embassy staff members would spend another month in a compound outside Tripoli, hoping that someone on their side figured it out in time. No pressure. Maddox had been in the range operations room for 40 minutes before he noticed the woman. She was standing outside the eastern edge of the firing position, holding what looked like a handheld weather meter, the kind that measured temperature, humidity, wind speed, and barometric pressure simultaneously. She was dressed in plain field clothes, no rank insignia, no unit patch, no tactical gear. She wore her dark hair pulled back without ceremony, and she was writing something in a small-bound notebook, with the focused quietness of someone who had already forgotten that other people existed. Maddox walked over to the range coordinator, a young Navy lieutenant named Carver, who looked like he had been awake for 36 hours. "Who is that?" Carver checked his clipboard. "Dr. Mara Voss, civilian ballistics specialist. She's assigned to the exercise as the atmospheric data recorder. Cross-agency attachment. She's been working with the Naval Surface Warfare Center for the past 3 years. She's recording weather data." "Yes, sir, for a sniper exercise. It's the new system has an integrated atmospheric compensation module. They want independent verification of the input data. She's basically here to make sure the sensors are giving the computer accurate numbers." Maddox looked at the woman again. She had not looked up. She was still writing, still measuring, still entirely absorbed in something he couldn't see from here. "She's not a shooter?" "No, sir. She's a research specialist. Academia, I think. She used to be with DARPA before the Surface Warfare Center." Maddox nodded once, the way men do when they've already decided something and are just confirming the paperwork. He walked back to his team. The exercise briefing happened at 7:30. The range master, a retired master chief named Hollis, walked the team through the setup, 13 positions, 13 rifles, the new electronic firing solution system running real-time atmospheric compensation. Each shooter would generate a solution independently through the system, then verify it against the team's manual backup calculation before firing. Target would be struck when the system's confidence interval reached 90% or above. It was, Hollis explained, a controlled but demanding exercise. The desert crosswinds at Red Mesa were notoriously variable. The terrain channeled air in ways that ground-level instruments often missed. The range had been testing the new system for 6 weeks, and the results had been, he paused, developmental. What does that mean? Asked Petty Officer First Class Luis Camacho, a compact, precise man from San Antonio who had grown up shooting jackrabbits from a moving truck and considered himself adequately prepared for most atmospheric challenges. It means, Hollis said carefully, that the system's accuracy at ranges above 3,500 meters has been inconsistent with the expected modeling parameters. The computer's been wrong, said Owen Reddick from the back of the room. He wasn't being difficult, he was just translating. The computer's been working through its calibration period, Hollis said. Been wrong, Reddick said again, not unkindly. Hollis moved on. They set up on the firing line at 900. The New Mexico desert at that hour was already building heat, not the brutal midday weight of it, but the early shimmer, the kind that made distance uncertain and air unpredictable. Each operator settled into position. Equipment was checked, rechecked, verified. The ballistic computers came online and began pulling atmospheric data from the range's sensor array, a network of 8 automated weather stations positioned across the terrain between the firing line and the target. The first shot was Maddox's. His solution came in at 92% confidence. Fired. The observation station at the target called it back. Clean miss, 6 inches low, 8 inches left. Maddox did not react visibly. He looked at the computer's solution, looked at his own manual backup, and found them identical. The system was pulling bad data. He said so quietly to Owen beside him. The second shoe fired. Another miss, similar deviation, slightly different direction. The third, the fourth. By the time the fifth operator had fired and received the same call from the observation station, the mood on the firing line had shifted from professional focus to something quieter and more dangerous. The particular frustration of capable men whose tools are failing them and who cannot yet tell whether the fault is in the tool or in themselves. That was when Mara Voss walked to the edge of the firing line. She didn't ask permission. She simply arrived, notebook in one hand, weather meter in the other, and stood about 3 feet behind Maddox's position, looking not at the target but at the ground between them and at the dry gullies running crosswise to the firing lane, at the rock shelves catching morning heat, at something invisible that seemed to hold her full attention. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was calm, not soft, just present. "Before the next shot, can I look at the sensor array data?" Maddox didn't turn around. "We're running a live exercise, I understand. I just want to check something in the atmospheric feed." Lieutenant Carver, who was sitting at the range coordination console nearby, pulled up the sensor display and angled the screen toward her. She looked at it for about 20 seconds. Then she said, "Your sensors are mounted at 1.8 meters. The dominant wind layer in this canyon runs between ground level and about 1 meter. You're measuring above the problem." Maddox turned around then. He was not a small man. He stood 6'2", carried 210 pounds without an ounce of it being decorative, and he had the kind of face that decades of serious outdoor work carves into something that doesn't easily show surprise. But something moved across it now, not anger yet. Just the first flicker of it. "You're the weather lady," he said. "Atmospheric data specialist," she said, without any particular feeling about the distinction.
Right.
He glanced at his team. Luis Camacho had turned to watch. So had 2 others. "And you think you've identified the reason 13 qualified naval special warfare operators have been sissing a target?" "Yes. In 20 seconds. The data was available before the exercise started. I've been watching the terrain since we arrived." She looked at her notebook briefly. "There are 3 wind layers between here and the target. The sensor array is reading the middle one accurately, but the middle layer isn't what your rounds are traveling through at this range. They're spending most of their flight in the low layer and the thermal layer near the target face. Those are running in different directions at different speeds," Luis Camacho said. From his position, "How different?" "The low layer is running roughly 11 knots from the northwest. The thermal near the target is running about 7 knots northeast. The middle layer, what your sensors are measuring, is running 9 knots from the west. The system's compensation module is applying the middle layer correction to the full flight path. It's accurate for about the first kilometer and significantly wrong for the last 2. The firing line was quiet. Maddox looked at Owen Reddick. Owen was looking at Mara with an expression that was not skepticism exactly. It was something more careful than that. "That's quite a detailed analysis," Maddox said finally, "for someone who isn't a shooter." "I'm not here to shoot," Mara said. "I'm here to make sure the data is accurate. Currently it isn't." Maddox's jaw tightened. He looked back at the target, nearly 4 kilometers of desert shimmer between them and a steel panel that had been stubbornly unimpressed by 13 of the Navy's best snipers. "Tell me something," he said, and his voice had picked up an edge now. The particular edge of a man who has decided to stop being polite about his irritation. Did you learn ballistics from a textbook? Field research, she said. And practical experience. Practical experience, he said it again like he was tasting it and finding it poorly seasoned. Because where I come from, practical experience means you've actually laid behind a rifle under pressure and made the shot. Where I come from, Mara said. The shot doesn't matter if the data behind it is wrong. Luis Camacho made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Several of the operators shifted. The tension on the firing line had taken on a new texture, not just the frustration of failed shots now, but something sharper. The friction of a challenge that nobody quite wanted to name directly. Maddox crossed his arms. You want to tell me what to do differently? Dr. Voss. Dr. Voss, you're welcome to. That's what you're here for. But don't walk onto my firing line and tell me my team is missing because of a weather sensor when we have 19 years of combined data telling us. Your combined experience is real, she said. She wasn't combative, she was simply precise, which somehow made it worse. It's also being given incorrect inputs. Experience can't compensate for corrupted data. Not at this range, Owen Reddick spoke from his position for the first time. Senior Chief, his voice was even, the shots are consistent, all of them low and left with small variations. That's not shooter error. That's a systematic problem in the solution. Maddox looked at Owen. Owen held his gaze, calm and certain. A long moment. Maddox turned back to Mara. So fix it. If you can read the desert that well, tell us the correction. I'd rather show you something first. She looked toward the range's equipment shed at the southern end of the firing position. Is there an older equipment inventory? Something in sealed storage? Carver frowned. There are some cases in the secondary equipment room. Legacy systems, mostly. The range hasn't rotated them out yet. I'd like to look. Maddox spread his hands. Be my guest, Doctor. While you're in there, we're going to keep shooting. Please don't, she said. He raised an eyebrow. Every round you fire with the current solution is going to the same wrong place, she said. You're not learning anything new. You're just burning ammunition. The silence after that was different from the others. It had weight to it. Several operators were watching Maddox now. Not the target. Give her 10 minutes, Owen Reddick said quietly. Maddox stood very still for a moment. Then he turned away from her, toward the range, toward the distant shimmer of the steel panel they had not yet touched. 10 minutes, he said, to no one in particular. Mara was already walking toward the equipment shed. She found what she was looking for in a sealed government case at the back of the secondary room, beneath 2 tarps and a shelf of obsolete electronics. The case itself was unremarkable matte gray composite. Standard military latches, government property tags from 15 years ago. But the rifle inside was not unremarkable. It was a custom-built long-range system, older than most of the operators on the firing line, with a stock worn smooth at the grip from years of real use. And on the stock, near the manufacturer's plate, someone had engraved a small symbol. A cump bisected by a lightning bolt. Mara ran across it once. She did not react visibly. She picked up the case and carried it back to the firing line. Owen Reddick saw the case before anyone else did. He was setting up his next firing solution, but he looked up when she walked past, and he saw what she was carrying. And something shifted in his face, something private and significant that he immediately locked back down. Is that he started. It was in your secondary storage, she said. That case is from Phantom Glass, he said, low enough that no one else could hear. She met his eyes for a moment.
You know the program, it wasn't a question.
Owen was quiet for 2 full seconds. I knew of it, he said. It was dissolved before most of my career. But I know what that symbol means. She set the case down and began to open it. Then you know this rifle has been in the field. Who was the shooter? He asked. She didn't answer. She lifted the rifle out of the case, with the particular care of someone who knew exactly what she was holding, checked the bolt, examined the barrel, and began adjusting the scope with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times before. Maddox had walked over. He stood looking at the rifle, then at her. You're going to shoot, you asked me to prove it, she said. I'm going to prove it. You want to take a shot at 4,000 meters, 3,980, she said. Luis Camacho was openly watching now, so were most of the team. Several of them had the expression of people who have decided to enjoy watching something entertaining, certain in the knowledge that the entertainment will confirm what they already believe. Dr. Voss. Maddox's voice had settled into something measured, careful. My team has been shooting for 3 hours. 14 combined years of sniper qualification. You are a weather specialist with a 40-year-old rifle. I am going to ask you one time, seriously, before this gets uncomfortable. Are you sure you want to do this? Mara picked up her notebook and her handheld meter. She looked out at the desert, not at the target, but at the terrain between them and it. The dust moving in the low gullies. the thermal shimmer rising off the rocks on the right side, the almost imperceptible shift in how the air was behaving near a dry creek bed 2 kilometers out. He watched it for a long time. The operators waited. The sun climbed. The desert did what deserts do, which is breathe without caring who is watching. And Owen Reddick, standing 6 feet from Maddox, was watching her with an expression he hadn't worn in years, not doubt, not certainty. Something that lived between them, the expression of a man who has started to wonder if something he thought was settled history is about to speak up. "I'm sure," Mara said. She sat down behind the rifle. "Then let's see it," Maddox said. What happened next was not what any of them expected. She didn't immediately adopt a shooting position. She sat cross-legged behind the rifle, notebook open across her knee, and she began writing. "What is she doing?" Luis Camacho said quietly. "Calculating," Owen said. "She's been out here all morning. She already has the data. She's building a new solution." "By hand?" Luis looked at him. "By hand at 4,000 meters? Owen didn't answer. The calculations took 18 minutes. No one spoke to her during them. Maddox stood with his arms crossed and said nothing, which was either patience or the performance of it. Even he couldn't have said which. The younger operators traded looks. A couple of them checked their phones. Luis Camacho sat down on an equipment case and watched her with the look of a man who has started to invest in an outcome he can't quite name yet. When she finally lay behind the rifle, her position was not textbook. It was adapted, angled differently than standard form, the stock placed slightly unconventionally against her shoulder. But it was not wrong. It was something else, a position shaped by specific purpose, fitted to what she was about to do, rather than to what the manual said about how it should look. Owen Reddick moved to her left side, about 3 feet back, and crouched down. He had picked up his own spotting scope without being asked. Maddox watched him do it. He didn't say anything. Mara settled. He stilled. The kind of stillness that is not absence of movement but active control of it. Breath slowed. Body settled into the earth. The entire physical self committed to a single sustained moment. The observation station at the target radioed. "Range is clear." "Observer position confirmed." Maddox keyed his radio. "Fire when ready." She did not fire. A minute passed. The desert air moved. She made a small adjustment, not to the scope, but to her own position, a fractional shift of weight. Luis Camacho muttered. "She's waiting for something." "Wind cycle," Owen said. He was looking through his spotting scope. The 3 layers aligned briefly. Short window. Every few minutes he paused. "She's reading the cycle." The younger operators looked at each other. Something was happening on the firing line that none of them had the language for yet. Not the sound of it. It was almost completely silent. But the quality of the silence had changed. Mara stopped breathing. The desert did one specific thing with its air that it did only once every few minutes, a brief, fleeting alignment, like 3 rivers momentarily running in the same direction before separating again. She exhaled. She fired. The sound of the shot was ordinary. All shots sound the same when you're behind them. The extraordinary part lives in what comes after the long wait, while the round travels a distance that human senses cannot naturally comprehend. Covering nearly 4 kilometers of variable air and terrain and physics, finding or not finding what it was sent for. The observation station was silent. 1 second. 2, 3. Maddox had turned toward the target. Watching the downrange telescope feed, his jaw was set. His expression gave nothing away. Luis Camacho had stood up from his equipment case without realizing he'd done it. Owen Reddick sat with his eye at the spotting scope, still waiting. The radio at the observation station crackled. And what came through it changed everything about the rest of that morning, and the rest of that mission, and the rest of the careers of every man standing on that firing line. "Confirmed impact," the observer's voice said. "Center zone." Inside the mark. Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. Then Luis Camacho said very quietly. Maddox had not moved. He was still looking at the downrange feed. His arms had come uncrossed at some point without him noticing. His hands were at his sides. Owen Reddick pulled back from the spotting scope. He looked at Mara, who was already sitting up, already reaching for her notebook again, already moving to the next step in her mind, whatever the next step was. Around them, 12 operators stood in the New Mexico sun and processed the fact that something they had collectively decided impossible had just happened, quietly in front of them, with no ceremony and no announcement. No one cheered, no one said anything worth recording. Desert held the silence, and the silence held the answer to a question none of them had thought to ask before today. Who is Mara Voss, really? Owen Reddick knew part of the answer. And the engraved symbol on the rifle's stock, the compass bisected by lightning, the mark of a program that officially no longer existed, told the rest of it to anyone who knew how to read it. Which on that firing line was only one man, and he was already rethinking every assumption he had arrived with that morning. Above them, behind the range's sensor array, A small indicator light on the automated feed controller blinked twice and went dark, a technical anomaly that Lieutenant Carver would not notice for another 40 minutes. By then it would already be too late to pretend it was accidental. Nobody moved for a long time after the radio call came through. Confirmed impact, center zone, inside the mark. Those 5 words had done something to the air on that firing line that no wind layer analysis could measure. Maddox was still standing with his arms at his sides, still looking at the downrange feed, still wearing the face of a man who had just watched the floor drop out from under a room he thought he knew perfectly well. Luis Camacho was the first one to speak. "Run it again," he said. "Call the observer back, confirm it's the right target." Lieutenant Carver was already on the radio. "Mesa observation. This is range control. Please confirm impact location and target identification." The reply came back without hesitation. "Range control. Steel panel Alpha 1, center scoring zone. Inside the marked is real and verified." Luis sat back down on his equipment case. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the ground between his boots, the way a man looks at something when he needs a moment to reorganize his understanding of a situation. Around him, 12 operators processed the information in 12 different ways. 2 of them were whispering to each other. One had taken off his sunglasses and was cleaning them, which was what he did when he didn't know what else to do with his hands. The youngest one on the team, Petty Officer 2nd Class Danny Holt, 26 years old, 8 months out of sniper school, was staring at Mara Voss with the undisguised attention of someone watching a magic trick and genuinely needing to understand the mechanism. Mara was not watching any of them. She was already sitting upright, notebook open again, writing something in the same focused shorthand she'd been using all morning. The rifle was still positioned in front of her, its barrel cooling in the desert air, its worn stock holding its small engraved secret where only Owen Reddick could see it from his angle. Owen had not moved from his crouch beside her. He was watching her write, and his expression had settled into something that was no longer quite the careful neutrality he'd arrived with. It was something older than that. Something that had been waiting a long time to surface. Maddox turned away from the downrange feed. He walked to the water cooler at the edge of the coordination area, poured himself a cup, drank it and set the cup down. He walked back. He stopped in front of Mara's position. "That was a real shot," he said. "Yes," she said, without looking up. 3,980 meters. With a 15-year-old rifle you pulled out of a storage case. The rifle is fine. Age doesn't degrade a well-maintained system." Maddox crouched down to her level. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the public edge. It was quieter now, not softer exactly, but more direct. The voice he used when he needed an honest answer from someone he wasn't sure he could trust yet. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Mara looked up from her notebook for the first time since the shot. She held his gaze for a moment, long enough to make the question feel considered, not dismissed. "Field research," she said. It was the same answer she'd given before. But then it landed differently. This time it wasn't a deflection. It was a door left ajar. Maddox studied her for another second, then stood. He turned to his team. "We're taking 30 minutes. Equipment check, hydration, sensor review. Nobody fires another round until we understand what just happened with the atmospheric data." He didn't say, "She was right." He didn't say, "I was wrong." But the 30-minute stand-down said both those things loudly enough. Owen Reddick waited until the team dispersed before he moved. He picked up the gray composite case and carried it to the equipment bench, set it down, and began examining the rifle with the particular attention of someone looking for confirmation of something he already suspected. He checked the serial plate, cross-referenced it against a number he carried in his memory. Not any document. His hand stopped. He set the rifle down. He walked to where Mara was standing, now at the edge of the firing area. Meter raised again, reading the air. "The serial number on that rifle," he said, keeping his voice low, "was issued to a Phantom Glass operator in 2009. I know that program was dissolved. I know the official record says the equipment was decommissioned." He paused. "The rifle your hands know how to handle was never supposed to exist in a storage case at Red Mesa." Mara lowered the meter. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she hadn't looked at anyone else on that firing line all morning. "You were at Coast," she said. It was not a question. "Owen went very still 2009, he said, Eastern Afghanistan. Traction gone wrong. We lost communication, lost the primary route. Within 40 minutes of losing the whole team, he stopped. There was a shooter. Unidentified position, covering our withdrawal. The official report said we extracted under our own fire support. But that wasn't what happened." His voice had dropped to just above the wind. "I always knew that wasn't what happened. I just never knew who was in that position." Mara didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the desert. at the 4,000 meters of emptiness between them and the steel panel that now bore the mark of an impossible shot. When she spoke, her voice was even. Not cold, just controlled in the way that people are controlled when the alternative is something they've chosen not to allow. "Your team came home," she said. "Because of someone who was never in the report." "No," she said quietly. "Because your team fought hard and made good decisions under pressure. I just made sure the pressure didn't get any worse." Owen stared at her. The desert breathed between them. Somewhere behind them, Maddox was talking to Carver about the sensor array. Luis Camacho was running manual calculations on a range card, his jaw tight with the focused energy of a man determined to understand what he'd missed. "You were Lieutenant Ellison," Owen said. "Mara Ellison." She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. She picked up her weather meter and her notebook and walked toward the range coordination table. And Owen Reddick stood in the desert sun and felt 15 years of a story he'd carried half complete finally click into its missing shape. Lieutenant Carver called across to the range. "Senior Chief, I've got something in the sensor feed you need to see." Maddox crossed to the coordination console. He looked at the display Carver was pointing to. His expression didn't change visibly, but his eyes sharpened, the specific sharpening of a man who has moved from one kind of problem to a completely different one. "When did that reading change?" he said. "I'm not sure," Carver said. "I've been going back through the logs. The feed from Station 4 looks like it was modified sometime this morning, before the exercise started." "Modified how?" "The altitude parameter on the sensor calibration. Someone adjusted it remotely. It moved the effective measurement height from ground-level baseline up to 1.8 meters. Carver hesitated. "Which is exactly what Dr. Voss identified as the problem." Maddox looked at Carver. "You're telling me someone deliberately recalibrated the sensor to give us wrong data?" "I'm telling you the sensor data changed between last night's verification run and this morning's exercise window. Don't know yet whether it was a system error or a manual input." "Who has remote access to the sensor array?" Carver pulled up a permissions list. "Staff. Surface Warfare Center Technical Liaisons. The contractor team that installed the new ballistic system," he scrolled. "And a civilian technical consultant listed as an observer for today's exercise. Name is Caleb Strain. He's registered with a private defense technology firm, Meridian Systems." Maddox absorbed this without expression. "Where is Strain now?" Carver looked around. "He signed in at 645. I haven't seen him since the exercise started." "Find him." Mara had been standing at the edge of the console during this exchange. She had not announced herself. She had simply drifted close enough to hear, which Maddox noticed. "Only now you knew," he said. "Not an accusation, a realization. I suspected," she said. The sensor pattern was wrong in a way that felt deliberate. Random calibration drift doesn't produce that kind of systematic error. It's too clean, too consistent. Whatever was feeding your ballistic computer this morning was designed to make the shots fail. Designed by who? "That's your question to answer," she said. "I'm a ballistic specialist." Luis Camacho had walked over. He'd heard enough. "Someone sandbagged our exercise," he said flatly. "Someone sat in a chair somewhere and reached into our system and made sure we couldn't hit that target." "It looks that way," Mara said.
What?
She looked at him steadily. "What's the exercise for?" "What happens if Far Horizon fails?" Luis worked through it. "The rescue mission. If we can't demonstrate accuracy at this range, the mission parameters change. Command might pull the long-range component, or they go with a different system." He stopped. "A more expensive system," Mara said, "sold by a company that benefits directly from the Navy's current procurement process failing." The silence that followed was the silence of men who are very good at dealing with physical danger, rearranging their understanding of what kind of danger they are actually inside. Danny Holt, who had been standing at the edge of this conversation, "That's not just sabotage. That's letting 12 people stay in a compound in Tripoli so someone can sell the Navy a better computer." Nobody answered that. Nobody needed to. Maddox turned away from the console. He walked to the far edge of the coordination area and stood with his back to his team for a moment, which was something he almost never did. He was processing not just the sensor sabotage, not just the failed shots, but the entire shape of the morning as it now appeared from this new angle. The woman he'd dismissed, the shot he'd challenged her to take, the rifle with the symbol he'd never seen before but Owen clearly recognized. All of it assembling into something larger and more complicated than a desert range exercise. Turned around. "Dr. Voss," he said. She looked at him. "I need you to walk me through your atmospheric solution. The complete one. Every layer, every calculation, everything you use to generate that firing solution. Why? Because if someone sabotaged this exercise, I need to know whether our manual backup data is clean. And right now you're the only person on this range whose numbers I know weren't touched by whatever Strain put into our system." Mara considered this for a moment. Then she opened her notebook and set it on the coordination table. They worked for 40 minutes. Mara walked Maddox through every element: the 3 wind layers, the thermal behavior near the target face, the timing of the alignment window, the manual pressure and humidity adjustments, the trajectory model she'd built by hand, using nothing but field instruments and math that predated the automated system by 20 years. Maddox was not a man who was easily impressed by technical detail. He had spent 2 decades making precision decisions under conditions that reduced most calculations to instinct. But he followed her work with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely learning something. And twice he stopped her to ask a question that was not defensive or skeptical, it was just honest inquiry. Lewis pulled up a chair and joined them halfway through. Then Danny Holt. By the end, 5 operators were standing around the coordination table, looking at a weather-worn notebook filled with handwritten calculations and genuinely trying to understand how it had produced an impact at nearly 4 kilometers that their $500,000 computer system couldn't replicate. Owen Reddick was not at the table. He had gone back to the secondary equipment room. He came back carrying something not equipment this time. Small worn field journal. Cover cracked at the spine. Its pages thickened with years of being opened and closed in difficult conditions. He set it on the table beside Mara's notebook without explanation. He looked at it, then she looked at him. "My original mission log," he said. "From Coast. I kept a personal copy outside officials. Some of us did. After the report came back," he paused. "The official version said we extracted under our own fire support. My version says something different." Maddox looked at the journal, then at Owen. "What does it say?" "It says there was a shooter in an unsupported position on the eastern ridge. It says that shooter held the extraction route open for 22 minutes while we got our people out. It says that without that position we lose at least 3 operators." Owen's voice was level, factual, the way he'd report weather data. "And it says that the official report, signed by Captain Roland Keene, makes no mention of any of that." The name landed on the table like something physical. Maddox recognized it. Keene. He's at Naval Special Warfare Command now. He was the reporting officer for the Coast extraction, Owen said. He wrote the report that classified the mission outcome as a self-extracted success. No outside support, no unidentified shooter. He looked at Mara. "Lieutenant Ellison." Maddox turned to Mara slowly. She was looking at Owen's journal. She had not touched it. She was reading the open page from where she stood, and her face was doing something careful and controlled that was not quite stillness. It was the expression of someone watching a piece of their own history appear in a place they never expected to find it. "Your record," Maddox said quietly. "It was sealed, yes. Keene's report. Yes, that's why you're a civilian. That's why you're a ballistic specialist at the Surface Warfare Center instead of." He stopped. Recalculated. "Before Coast." She closed her notebook. "Reconnaissance. Long-range observation and precision fire support. Qualified at the time I left service. I held the highest confirmed engagement record in my program." She said it without pride or bitterness. Just facts, the same way she said everything else. Program was Phantom Glass. It was dissolved after Coast, officially because of budget realignment. The real reason was more complicated, Keene, Owen said. He recommended dissolution in his after-action assessment. Said the program's methodology was unreliable. Said the Coast extraction proved that unsupported long-range assets couldn't be trusted in dynamic situations. She paused. The irony being that the Coast extraction was the proof of the opposite. Luis Camacho had gone quiet in a way that was different from his earlier quiet. He was looking at Mara with the expression of a man who has just completed a long and complicated equation and doesn't entirely like the answer. "You've been carrying this for 15 years, he said. "I've been doing my job for 15 years, she said. "Ballistics research, atmospheric modeling, system verification. Useful work. But not the work you were trained for." She looked at him. "No." The coordination console chirped. Carver looked at the alert. His face shifted. Senior Chief Caleb Strain just badged into the range director's office. Maddox was already moving. "Don't let him leave." He covered the distance to the range director's office in about 40 seconds, which was not quite running but was everything short of it. Owen fell into step 2 paces behind him. Luis went wide to cover the building's secondary exit without being told to. Strain was at the desk in the range director's office when Maddox walked in. He was a compact man in his mid-40s, dressed in civilian contractor clothes, with the practiced ease of someone who spends a lot of time in government facilities and has learned to look like he belongs in all of them. He was holding a tablet and appeared to be reviewing documents. He looked up when Maddox entered. "Senior Chief, I was just reviewing the morning's data logs. The exercise produced some interesting." "You have remote access to the sensor array," Maddox said. Strain's expression adjusted. Not dramatically, just a small recalibration, the kind that happens in the face of someone who is professionally accustomed to managing difficult conversations. As a technical consultant for the system integration, yes, I have access to the calibration interface. Standard for the altitude parameter on Station 4 was modified between last night's verification and this morning's exercise window. The modification produced systematic errors in the atmospheric compensation module. My team spent 3 hours firing solutions into the wrong desert. Strain put the tablet down. Sensor calibration drift is a known variable in field deployments. If there was a parameter change, it could have been wasn't drift, Maddox said. It was a manual input. We can see the access log. Then Strain said, with the careful precision of a man choosing each word like he's stepping on ice, I think this conversation should probably involve legal counsel and the range director before. A civilian contractor in a compound outside Tripoli is waiting for a rescue mission that depends on data that someone deliberately corrupted, Maddox said. I'm not interested in your counsel timeline, Mr. Strain. Interested in why? Strain said nothing. Owen Reddick stepped into the room. He had been standing in the doorway, and he moved forward now with the unhurried certainty of someone who has decided that the conversation has reached the point where his presence changes it. Meridian Systems, Owen said. Your company, they make a competing ballistic compensation system. More expensive than the Navy's current contract. Been trying to get into the procurement pipeline for 2 years. He tilted his head. If Project Far Horizon fails, the Navy's current system loses credibility. Procurement opens back up. Strain looked between them. His face had gone through several expressions in the last 90 seconds and had arrived at something that was not quite defiance and not quite capitulation, the uncomfortable middle place of a man whose plan has met an obstacle he hadn't fully modeled. I want to speak to the range director, he said. He's been called, Maddox said. So has the base commander. As if on cue, the door opened. Rear Admiral Elias Munro walked in, not hurrying, but with the compressed authority of a man who has been informed that his exercise has been sabotaged and has made certain decisions about how the next hour will proceed before he crossed the threshold. He looked at Maddox, he looked at Strain, he looked at the tablet on the desk. Tell me what we have, he said. Maddox told him. It took 4 minutes. Munro listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of statement. When Maddox finished, Munro looked at Strain for a long moment. You are going to remain on this base. You are not going to communicate with anyone outside this installation until my JAG officer has completed a preliminary review of the sensor access logs. He paused. And you are going to understand clearly that 12 American civilians are waiting for a rescue operation that your actions this morning attempted to compromise. Whatever your reasons, whatever your company's interests, that is what you are responsible for this morning. Strain opened his mouth. Munro turned away from him. Senior Chief Maddox. I want to meet with you and Dr. Voss in 30 minutes. Bring your team's manual calculations and whatever she has in that notebook. He walked out. Maddox followed. Owen came last, and as he passed Strain, he stopped for just a moment. You picked the wrong range, Owen said simply. Wrong team, wrong day. He walked out, back at the coordination table. Mara had not stopped working. She was building something from her calculations, a revised atmospheric model that accounted for the corrupted sensor data, cross-referenced against her independent field measurements. When Maddox came back and told her about Munro's meeting request, she nodded without looking up. I'll need 20 more minutes, she said. You'll have it. Luis was beside her now, not hovering, contributing. He had a range card and a calculator, and he was running parallel checks on her numbers, calling out results, and she was confirming or correcting them with the quiet efficiency of a collaboration that had found its rhythm without any formal agreement to do so. Danny Holt brought her water. He set it down without making a thing of it. She said thank you without looking up. He went back to his position. Small things. But Maddox noticed them the way he noticed everything on a firing line, because the behavior of a team is data. Something had shifted in the 40 minutes since the shot. Not dramatically, not ceremonially, but the 13 men on that range were relating to the woman at the coordination table differently than they had been at 900. Not because she'd performed for them, not because she'd demanded anything, simply because she had shown them something true, and the truth had adjusted the room. Owen sat down next to Maddox at the edge of the area. He had his personal journal in his hands. He was looking at it, not opening it. Keene wrote that report to protect his record, he said quietly. The Coast operation went wrong because of a decision he made on the intelligence side. The wrong insertion point, bad source verification. He signed off on a route that was already compromised. When it fell apart, he needed the after-action to show a controlled extraction, not a near disaster saved by a program he'd been trying to defund. Maddox absorbed Phantom glass was his target. It was expensive. It was unconventional, and it operated outside the normal chain of oversight. Keene didn't like programs he couldn't control. After Coast, he had the documentation he needed to recommend dissolution. Owen turned the journal in his hands. What he didn't count on was someone keeping a real record. "You kept it for 15 years, Maddox said. "I kept it because I knew the official version was wrong. I just didn't know who I was keeping it for." He looked across the range to where Mara was working, her pen moving across the notebook, her voice steady as she confirmed a calculation for Luis. "I know now." Maddox followed his gaze. He stayed quiet for a long moment. "You could have told us," he said finally. "When she identified the sensor problem. She could have led with phantom glass. With Coast. With her record." "Yes," Owen said. "She didn't." "No." Maddox thought about that. "She just fixed the problem." "That's what she came to do," Owen said. Maddox nodded slowly. Something was moving behind his eyes, not visible yet, but working its way toward the surface. The kind of internal reckoning that doesn't make noise when it happens, but changes things permanently. "I called her a weather girl," he said. Owen said nothing, in front of the whole team, still nothing. Stood. He walked to the water cooler, poured a cup, didn't drink it. He set it down and came back. He looked at the desert, at the 4,000 meters of it that held the answer to a question he'd asked in the wrong tone of voice that morning. "Payne, how bad was Coast, really, before she held that ridge?" Owen opened his journal to a specific page. He'd had it memorized for 15 years, but he looked at it anyway. He read it. Then he looked up. "Bad enough," he said. "I've said a private thank you every year since. To someone I didn't have a name for." Maddox said nothing. He turned and walked toward the range coordinator's station to prepare for the Admiral's meeting. Above the sensor array at the far edge of the range, the indicator light that had blinked twice and gone dark was still dark. In the range director's office, Caleb Strain was sitting in a chair, his tablet face down on the desk, working through the specific calculus of a man deciding how much to say and how fast to say it before someone else fills in the blanks without him. He had not yet decided whether what he'd done was solely his idea. And in 30 minutes, when Admiral Monroe asked him that question directly, the name he would eventually offer quietly after a long pause, with the expression of a man stepping off a ledge, would reach across 15 years of buried history and pull something long hidden up into the light. A name that Mara Voss had never spoken aloud on that range. A name that Owen Reddick had written in a journal that wasn't supposed to exist. A name that had signed a report that destroyed a career and kept 12 operators' lives out of the official record. Captain Roland Keene, the desert outside, held its heat. Steel panel 4,000 meters away bore the mark of an impossible shot. And on the coordination table, beside a worn notebook filled with handwritten calculations, Mint water cup sat next to the journal of a man who had waited 15 years to tell the truth to the right people. The 30 minutes were almost up. Admiral Monroe didn't sit down when he entered the briefing room. That told Maddox everything he needed to know about the next 30 minutes. Monroe was 61 years old, thin in the way that career military men get thin not from neglect but from decades of burning everything that wasn't essential. He had the kind of authority that didn't require volume. When he stood at the head of a table, the room organized itself around him the way iron filings organize around a magnet. Not because he demanded it, because everything in the space simply understood where the center was. He looked at Mara's notebook open on the table. He looked at Owen's journal beside it. He looked at Maddox, then at Mara, then at Owen. Then he pulled out a chair, sat down and said, "Strain gave us a name." The room went completely still. Says he didn't act alone. He says the access credentials he used to modify the sensor array came from inside the Navy. Someone with system-level clearance on the Far Horizon procurement file gave him the technical pathway into the range's calibration interface. Monroe folded his hands on the table. Says the name is Captain Roland Keene. Owen Reddick closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, his expression was the controlled flatness of a man who has just heard the thing he already knew confirmed out loud, and is now deciding what to do with the feeling that produces. Maddox said, "Keene is at Naval Special Warfare Command. He oversees procurement evaluation for advanced targeting systems," Monroe said. "Which means he had both the access and the motive." He paused. "If the Navy's current long-range system fails its field validation, the procurement process reopens. Meridian Systems Strain's employer has been lobbying that evaluation committee for 2 years, and Keene has been on that committee." Luis Camacho, standing at the back of the room, said quietly, "He set up the exercise to fail. From the inside, that appears to be the situation," Monroe said. Mara had been sitting at the table throughout this exchange, her hands flat on the surface beside her notebook, listening, with the particular quality of attention that doesn't announce itself. Monroe looked at her directly for the first time. "Doctor, Voss, he said. Owen Reddick has made me aware of his personal mission log from the coast extraction in 2009. He tells me official after-action report filed by Captain Keene. He paused. He also tells me that the unidentified shooter referenced in his log, the operator who held the eastern ridge for 22 minutes and kept his team's extraction route open, was you. Mara said nothing. Is that accurate? A long beat. The kind that has weight behind it, she said. Monroe let that sit for a moment. Your service record was sealed following the coast operation. Your qualification was administratively removed. You accepted a civilian research post. He looked at her steadily. You've been doing ballistics research for 15 years when you should have been doing something else. I've been doing useful work, she said. That's not the same thing. No, she said, it isn't. Monroe turned to Owen. Your journal, is it complete? Dates, coordinates, operational timeline? Everything, Owen said. I wrote it the night we got back, before the official report was filed. I kept it because I knew what was in the real version, and I knew what was going to be in Keene's version. And I thought he stopped, restarted. I thought someday the difference would matter. It matters today, Monroe said. Stood up. He walked to the window, not looking out. Just moving the way people move when they're making a decision that has more than one weight to it. Then he turned back. Here is where we are, he said. Strain's modification of the sensor array is documented in the access logs. His testimony implicates Keene. Owen's journal provides a 15-year-old record of a falsified after-action report. And Dr. Voss's shot this morning, he glanced at the notebook. At 3,980 meters, with corrupted electronic data, using a manual solution built entirely from field instruments. Now part of this range's verified record, he looked at Mara. I have one question for you before we go any further. Not procedural, personal. She waited. Why didn't you say any of this before the exercise started? You knew about the sensor problem before the first shot was fired. You could have identified yourself, explained your background, invoked your operational history. You chose not to. He tilted his head slightly. Why? Mara looked at him with an expression that was not defiance and not submission. It was something more tired and more honest than either of those. Because it shouldn't have required any of that, she said. The data was wrong. The data being wrong was the problem that needed solving. My name, my history, my qualification, none of that changes what the wind was doing this morning. She paused. If the only way my assessment gets taken seriously is because of who I used to be, then we haven't actually fixed anything. Monroe held her gaze for a long moment. Then quietly he said, no, I don't suppose we have. He turned to Maddox. Here is what happens next. Strain remains on base under restricted movement. I'm initiating a formal inquiry into the sensor modification and Keene's involvement. Jake will be here by tomorrow morning. He looked at the window again, then back. And we still have a rescue mission. 12 people in a compound outside Tripoli who don't care about any of this. They care about whether someone is coming for them, and whether that someone has accurate data. The atmospheric model is clean, Mara said. My independent measurements weren't touched by what Strain did to the sensor array. I can build a verified solution for the mission parameters. Monroe looked at her. How long? Give me the mission terrain data. In 6 hours you have 4, Monroe said. The operational window doesn't move. She nodded. 4, Maddox. Monroe turned to him. Your team's manual calculation protocols, are they solid? They will be, Maddox said. And there was something in the way he said it, not the reflexive assertion of a man defending his team's reputation, but something quieter, more deliberate, more earned. He looked briefly at Mara when he said it, though she wasn't looking back. Monroe picked up his cap. My office. 1 hour. Bring the notebook. He walked out. The room exhaled. For a moment nobody spoke. Luis Camacho looked at the ceiling. Danny Holt was standing very still near the door, processing the architecture of what he'd just witnessed. Owen was looking at his journal, closed now, held in both hands. Maddox looked at Mara. She was already opening her notebook to a fresh page. 4 hours, he said. I heard him. You need anything? She looked up. It was a small moment, but something in it was different from every other time he'd spoken to her that morning. The texture of the question was different. She seemed to notice. Terrain maps for the Tripoli area of operation, she said. Current pressure readings from the Mediterranean coast. And someone who can run parallel calculations without slowing me down. Maddox turned. Luis was already pulling up a chair outside. The New Mexico desert was doing something that deserts do in the early afternoon, building heat in layers, stacking thermal currents, creating exactly the kind of variable atmospheric environment that had defeated 13 snipers that morning and not defeated Mara Voss. The irony of the location was not lost on anyone who was paying attention. Storm was also building. Not immediately, not in the next hour, but the barometric readings that Mara had been tracking since dawn showed a pressure system moving in from the west that would make conditions on the range significantly more complicated by late afternoon. She had noted it in her notebook at 7:15 that morning. She had said nothing about it to anyone, because at 7:15 no one had been interested in what she had to say about anything. That had changed. The next 3 hours were the most concentrated work any of them had done that day, which was saying something given what the day had already contained. Marca built the atmospheric model for the Tripoli operation from the ground up, using the same method she'd used on the Red Mesa range-independent field data, layered wind analysis, terrain-specific thermal modeling. Luis ran the parallel calculations with a precision that surprised her. Not because she'd underestimated him, but because the speed of his adjustment told her something about who he actually was when he wasn't defending a position. Danny Holt came in at the 90-minute mark with updated pressure data from the Mediterranean stations. He'd pulled it himself, found the right database, formatted it correctly, and handed it over without making it a thing. Mara incorporated it without comment. Danny went back to his position. Owen Reddick sat in the corner of the coordination room for most of those 3 hours. He wasn't calculating. He wasn't talking. He was holding his journal and doing something internal that didn't have a military designation. Somewhere around the 2-hour mark, he opened it to the co-host entry and read it again, not because he'd forgotten it, but because reading it now, in this room, after this morning, felt different from every other time he'd read it in 15 years. He had written, "Unknown shooter, Eastern Ridge, held for 22 minutes under active contact. No identification possible. Team extract intact? Without that position, we lose Garnt, Whitfield, and Torres at minimum." Barca was retired now and coaching youth baseball in Phoenix. Whitfield had made Master Chief. Torres had died in a training accident in 2017, 3 years after his second child was born. Owen looked at Mara across the room. She was writing fast, asking Luis a question without looking up, receiving the answer, incorporating it, moving forward. She had been doing this for 15 years in a civilian research post. She had been doing ballistics work that mattered to programs she'd never see deployed, for operators she'd never meet, in operations she'd never be credited for. He thought about Garza coaching youth baseball. He thought about Torres's kid, who would be 12 now. He closed the journal. At the 2-hour 40-minute mark, something happened that changed the shape of the afternoon. Maddox's radio chirped. He stepped out of the coordination room to take it. When he came back, his face was carrying something new, not alarm exactly, but the heightened attention of a man who has received information that requires immediate recalculation. "Storm is moving faster than projected," he said. "Range meteorology is now calling it hitting Red Mesa in approximately 90 minutes. If we're going to run a final live verification exercise before we take this data to the mission team, we need to do it in the next hour." Mara looked up from her notebook. "That's early," I said. "The pressure system would arrive by late afternoon." "Your reading was right. The projection service was working from the standard model. They didn't account for..." He paused. "They didn't account for the same low-altitude wind layer that threw off our exercise this morning." She looked at him. He looked back. There was something almost wry in the air between them, though neither of them smiled. 90 minutes, she said. Maybe less. She looked at the notebook, at the calculations. At Luis. "Can we verify the solution at this range before the storm hit?" "One shot," Maddox said. "Clean conditions are closing fast. We get one clean window." "When?" 40 minutes. After that, the wind variance becomes too high for a meaningful verification. Mara stood up. She picked up the notebook. She looked at the coordination room door, where 3 of the team's operators had gathered without anyone officially summoning them, just men who had felt the change in atmosphere and moved toward it, the way operators move toward the sound of something significant. "Dead." Maddox nodded. He keyed his radio. "All positions, range is going active. Final verification exercise. Single shot, 40-minute window, get to your stations." The filing line assembled in 11 minutes. 13 operators, plus Mara, plus Owen, who had put his journal in his vest pocket and picked up his spotting scope without being asked. The desert air had already changed. The storm's leading edge was pushing something through the upper thermal layers. Anyone with experience could feel the instability building like a frequency shift in a signal they knew how to read. Mara set up behind the phantom glass rifle, same position as that morning. Same worn stock. Same small engraved compass and lightning symbol that Owen could see from where he crouched beside her. But this time the firing line felt different. 13 men setting up their own positions, not because they were going to shoot, but because they wanted to follow the solution. They wanted to understand what she was doing and how she was doing it. Not performance. Not courtesy. Genuine professional investment in a method they'd been wrong to dismiss. Stood behind the line, not at his own position. He stood where he could see both Mara and the downrange telescope. He had his arms at his sides. Rear Admiral Monroe had come down from the coordination building. Stood at the edge of the firing area, hands clasped behind his back. Watching Lieutenant Carver was at the range console, trying to look like he wasn't holding his breath. Danny Holt had his own spotting scope. He'd set it up to the right of Owens, giving them 2 independent observation positions on the target. Nobody had told him to do that, it was just a good idea. And he'd had it. Mara was still the desert, moved around her the building pressure, the shifting thermal currents, the upper layer instability from the incoming storm, and she was reading all of it simultaneously, the way she'd been trained to read it in a program that officially no longer existed. The 3 wind layers were behaving differently now than they had at 900. The storm's approach had elevated the velocity in the middle layer and suppressed the low-altitude current. The thermal near the target was running hotter and faster as the pressure differential increased. It was a completely different atmospheric problem from this morning. She did not use this morning's solution. She recalculated. Maddox watched her write. He had stopped feeling impatient about it sometime in the last 3 hours. He wasn't sure exactly when. He just knew that watching Mara Voss calculate was no longer something he experienced as delay. It was something he experienced as process, the same way he experienced watching a good mechanic work on an engine or a good medic work on a wound. The competence was visible in the movement. You didn't have to understand every step to know that the steps were right. 2 minutes, she said to Owen. Ready, he said. The middle layer has accelerated. Call it 12 knots northwest. The thermal near the target face is running hot. I'm reading it closer to 9 northeast now. Up from 7 this morning. The low layer has dropped. Almost negligible. She made a small scope adjustment. The solution is different from this morning. The window is also shorter. Storm is compressing the alignment interval. How short? Owen asked. Maybe 20 seconds, possibly less. Luis, from his position 2 spots down the line, said 20 seconds. What do we watch for? The dust in the second gully. She didn't look up. When it stops moving for 3 consecutive seconds, the layers are aligning. That's the window. Owen raised his spotting scope toward the second gully. 2 kilometers downrange, he found the dust. It was moving, skittering. Variable, the chaotic micro-behavior of air that hasn't settled into its pattern yet. The firing line waited. Above them, the sky had developed a particular quality that storm skies develop, not dark, but waited. The light had changed in a way that was hard to name, but immediately felt. The desert was holding itself differently, the way living things hold themselves when something large is approaching. Caleb Strain, under restricted movement in the range director's building, was watching through the window. Nobody had told him he couldn't watch. He had his hands in his pockets, and his face was carrying the complicated expression of a man whose plan to discredit the demonstration is about to be conclusively disproven by the demonstration itself. Captain Roland Keene, 3 time zones away at Naval Special Warfare Command, did not yet know that his name was on a table in New Mexico. He was in a procurement meeting, reviewing a slide deck from Meridian Systems, nodding at intervals with the practiced approval of a man who has already decided and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. He would know within the hour. On the firing line, Owen's voice came low and steady. Second gully. Dust is slowing. Mara's breathing had shifted. Anyone trained to look for it would have seen it, the subtle elongation of each exhale, the deliberate slowing of the respiratory cycle, the body committing itself to stillness as a precision instrument. Flowing, Owen said again. Luis had raised his own scope. Danny Holt was at his spotting position, motionless. Maddox didn't move. Monroe didn't move. Even Lieutenant Carver, at the console, had gone still in the particular way of someone who doesn't know what they're watching, but knows it's significant. 2 seconds, Owen said. The dust in the second gully stopped. There, Owen said. Mara fired. The sound of the shot broke across the desert and was immediately absorbed by it, the ordinary, unremarkable sound of a round leaving a barrel, carrying with it everything that was extraordinary about the morning and afternoon that had produced it. The round crossed the first kilometer. The second. The variable thermal layers that should have deflected it, should have pushed it low and left the way they'd pushed 13 shots that morning into the dirt and wrong desert. It crossed the 3rd kilometer, dropping through the trajectory arc that 15 years of field mathematics had predicted to the decimal. It crossed the 4th kilometer. The observation station had been watching since the shot. The observer had his call ready before the flight time completed. Confirmed impact. Center zone. Inside the mark, nobody reacted immediately. Not because they hadn't believed it could happen, they had. The first shot that morning had recalibrated what they believed was possible. But because the second shot, taken under deteriorating atmospheric conditions, with a storm building and a 20-second window and a completely recalculated solution generated in real time, was something different from the first. The first shot had been a statement. The second shot was a proof. Luis Camacho said she changed the solution completely, Owen confirmed. Different solution, same result. Because the conditions changed, Danny Holt said. He said it slowly, working through it. She didn't repeat the morning's answer. She rebuilt it for what was actually there. That's the point, Owen said. That's what the computer can't do when the inputs are corrupted. It applies the same solution to a different problem. He lowered his spotting scope. She reads what's actually there. Maddox had not moved from his position behind the line. He was looking at the downrange feed, at the confirmed impact marker on the steel panel, and he was doing something that was visible on his face, in a way that he probably wasn't aware of, a kind of internal accounting, slow and thorough, the kind that produces significant changes in how a person understands a situation they thought they understood before. He turned. Mara was sitting up behind the rifle. She was reaching for her notebook. She was apparently already moving to the next thing in her mind, whatever the next thing was. Maddox walked to her. He crouched down to her level, the same way he had that morning, but the posture was different now. This time it was not the crouch of a man asserting position. It was the crouch of a man trying to have a conversation at eye level. Dr. Voss, he said. She looked at him. I said some things this morning that he stopped. Started again. On this firing line, I made a public assessment of your competence, based on what you were holding and what you were wearing and the fact that you were correcting me in front of my team. He paused. I was wrong. She watched him. Not just about the shot, he said. About all of it. About the way I spoke to you, about the assumption I made. He held her gaze. I'm sorry, it was not a formal procedural apology. It didn't have the protective shell that official apologies develop when they're delivered for institutional record. It was direct and undecorated, and it cost him something to say it in front of his team. And he said it anyway. Mara looked at him for a moment. I accept that, she said then, but Grant, it was the first time she'd used his name. He registered it. Respect that only arrives after someone performs a miracle isn't enough. It needs to come before someone has to bleed for it. Before the mission, before the firing line. She held his gaze. That's what we haven't fixed yet, he didn't argue. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has understood something that will take time to fully become part of how he operates, but who has genuinely understood it. He stood, he turned to his team. 12 operators, Owen, Danny Holt, Camacho. All of them watching. We have a mission, he said, and we have clean data. Let's get to work. The storm arrived 17 minutes later. It came in hard from the west, pushing wind and grit across the mesa with the indifference of weather that doesn't know about sniper exercises or procurement corruption or 15-year-old falsified reports. It shut the range down within 20 minutes and covered the firing line in a layer of fine red dust that made the whole morning feel like something that had happened in a different atmosphere than the one currently outside the window. Inside the coordination building, Mara was at the table with the mission terrain data, building the atmospheric solution for North Africa with the same handwritten precision she'd used all day. Luis was beside her. Danny was running data. Owen was on the phone with someone, not the base. Not just a call he'd decided to make, quiet and certain, that had to do with a name in a journal and a decision about what to do with 15 years of preserved truth. Monroe was in the range director's office, talking to Naval Special Warfare Command. The conversation was not going to be comfortable for everyone involved. Monroe was not interested in comfortable, he was interested in accurate. And in the room with Mara, as the storm beat against the windows and the data built toward a verified solution that 12 people in a Tripoli compound were depending on, something had settled in the air among those operators that hadn't been there that morning. Not camaraderie exactly, they'd had that before. Something more specific. The understanding of what a mistake looks like when you make it clearly, and what it looks like when you're willing to call it by its real name. Maddox sat at the end of the table, watching Mara work. He had a cup of coffee he'd stopped drinking. His elbows were on the table and his hands were together in front of his face, and he was thinking the deep, structural kind of thinking that doesn't produce words yet, but is changing something in the foundation. Eventually, he said quietly, to no one in particular, 15 years. Luis looked at him. She held that ridge for 22 minutes and they took her qualification and put her behind a weather desk. He looked down at his coffee. 15 years. Nobody answered. There wasn't an answer that would have been adequate. There was only the storm outside and the data on the table, and the notebook filled with 15 years of handwritten calculations from a woman who had gone on doing what she was trained to do long after they took away the official permission to do it. Owen came back into the room. He sat down. He put his journal on the table. He looked at Mara. "I made a call," he said to Garza. "He's going to talk to Whitfield. Between the two of them and my journal, we have 3 independent operator accounts of the coast extraction." He paused. "Keen's report won't survive that." Mara stopped writing. He looked at Owen, and something moved across her face. Not breakdown, not collapse, not the dramatic release of 15 years of compressed weight. Just a small quiet shift. The expression of someone who has been carrying something a long time and has just been told, credibly for the first time, that they can put it down. "Thank you," she said, very quietly. "It's not a favor," Owen said. "It's just what happened. We're just finally saying what actually happened." She nodded. He looked back at the notebook. She picked up her pen. Outside, the storm pushed hard against the New Mexico desert, rearranging the dust and the air and the surface of everything, the way storms do. And inside, 4,000 meters from a steel panel that bore the mark of 2 impossible shots, 12 operators, and 1 woman, and a mission that wasn't finished, yet pressed forward through the noise toward something that might actually be true. On the range director's desk, Caleb Strain's tablet sat face down beside a cup of cold coffee. The access log on that tablet showed a single remote modification to the Red Mesa sensor array, timestamped 612 that morning, and below the timestamp, in the technical metadata that most people would never look for, an authorization code linked to a Naval Special Warfare Command clearance. Roland Keen's clearance. The JAG officer's flight from San Diego was already in the air. The JAG officer's name was Commander Diane Reyes, and she arrived at Red Mesa at 2,140 hours with a laptop, a legal pad, and the specific energy of someone who has read a briefing document on a plane and arrived already certain that the situation is worse than the summary suggested. She was 43, sharp in the way that years of military legal work makes people sharp, not aggressive, but precise in a way that left no comfortable room for vagueness. She shook Monroe's hand, nodded to Maddox, and asked for Strain before she'd taken off her jacket. Strain had been sitting in the range director's office for 6 hours. He had eaten a sandwich that Lieutenant Carver had brought him, and drunk 3 cups of coffee, and revised his internal calculus approximately 40 times about what to say and how much of it to say and in what order. By the time Reyes walked in, he had arrived at the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent a full day deciding whether to protect himself or protect the person who handed him the rope he'd used to hang himself with. Reyes sat across from him. She opened her laptop. She did not offer pleasantries. "Mr. Strain," she said, "I've reviewed the sensor access log. I've reviewed your credentials, your company's procurement history, and your communication records from the last 90 days. I've also reviewed the testimony you provided to Admiral Monroe this afternoon." She paused. "I want to give you one opportunity, before this becomes a formal proceeding, to tell me whether the account you gave the Admiral was complete." Strain looked at his hands. "It was accurate. I didn't ask if it was accurate. I asked if it was complete." He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that has a shape to it. "Keen didn't just provide credentials," he said finally. "He provided the modification parameters. He told me exactly which sensor to adjust, exactly what value to change it to, and exactly when to do it so it would be outside the morning verification window." He looked up. "Didn't design the sabotage, I executed it." Reyes wrote something. "Did he tell you why?" "He said the Navy's current system was going to fail on its own eventually. He said Far Horizon was going to embarrass the program, and it was better to control the conditions of that failure than to let it happen in the field." Strain's voice had lost its earlier careful management. It sounded like what it was now, the voice of a man who had made a calculation that looked clean from a distance and catastrophic up close. He made it sound like damage control, like we were protecting the mission infrastructure. By sabotaging the exercise that was protecting the mission, yes. He said it quietly. "I understand how that sounds." Mr. Strain. Reyes closed her laptop halfway. 12 American civilians have been in a hostile compound for 31 days. The exercise you sabotaged this morning was designed to verify the data that a rescue team is depending on. She looked at him evenly. "How does that sound to you?" He didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that would have been anything other than what it was. In the coordination room down the hall, Mara was still at the table. It was past 10 at night, and she had been working since before sunrise, and the North Africa atmospheric model was complete and verified and printed on 4 pages of graph paper that Luis had found in a supply cabinet and that now sat in a neat stack beside her notebook. She was not working on anything. She was sitting with a cup of tea that had gone cold, looking at the wall. Owen sat across from her. He'd been there for an hour. He wasn't talking. He was just there, the way people are there for each other when the thing that needs to happen isn't a conversation. Maddox came in at 2,200. He looked at the completed model on the table. He looked at Mara. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Reyes is with strain, he said. I know, Mara said. He gave Monroe Keene's name. He's giving Reyes the details. Maddox put his hands flat on the table. Gonna move fast now. Keene is gonna be contacted tonight. Mara looked at the cold tea. He'll deny it. He will, she said. He's been denying things for 15 years. He's very good at it. Maddox looked at Owen. Owen reached into his vest pocket and put the journal on the table. Garza and Whitfield are both on record, he said. I talked to them both tonight. Garza remembered the Eastern Ridge position without me describing it first. He brought it up himself. He said he'd never stopped wondering who was up there. Owen paused. Whitfield said the same thing. Mara wrapped both hands around the cold cup. She wasn't drinking it, just holding it. 3 independent operator accounts, she said. 4, Maddox said. They both looked at him. I pulled the raw communications from the Coast operation, he said. They're in the classified archive. I requested access 2 hours ago and Monroe approved it. He laid a printed document on the table, a communications transcript. 15 years old, the timestamp and classification markings visible at the top. There's a transmission on the extraction frequency at 2,247 local time. Short, partially degraded. But it's there, he pointed to a line. Unknown call sign. Eastern Grid. Quest raw confirmation. Owen leaned forward. He read the line, his jaw tightened. Mara did not lean forward. He looked at Maddox. That call sign, she said. PG-7. Phantom Glass 7, Maddox said quietly. That was your designation. Yes, it's in the archive. It was never redacted because whoever cleaned the official record didn't know to look in the raw communications file. He paused. Keene's report doesn't mention it. The cleaned version doesn't include it. But the original transmission log does. The coordination room held that information for a moment. Owen picked up his journal and set it on top of the communications transcript. That's a lot of things that weren't supposed to still exist, he said. People keep records, Maddox said. Even when they're told not to. Especially then. Mara looked at the stack of evidence on the table. Owen's journal, the communications transcript, the completed atmospheric model, her own notebook filled with 15 years of handwritten calculations. All of it assembled in a coordination room in the New Mexico desert, on the night of a day that had started with 13 snipers laughing at a woman holding a weather meter. She exhaled slowly. Just the long, controlled exhale of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally reached the place where she can set it down. What happens to him, she said. Keene, Maddox considered. Reyes will recommend formal charges. Procurement fraud, at minimum. Obstruction if the Coast falsification holds, and it will hold conduct unbecoming. Potentially more. He ends. His career ends tonight when Reyes makes the call. Cooperating witness. He'll face consequences, but he'll face them with a lawyer and a reduced exposure. Maddox looked at the table. He made a bad decision for money. Keene made a bad decision for power and spent 15 years building on top of it. The difference matters, Owen said. Legally and otherwise. Mara nodded slowly, then she said, I don't want Keene destroyed because of what he did to me. I want him held accountable because of what he did to your team that night. She looked at Owen. Garza, Whitfield, Torres. That's why it matters. Not because of my record. Owen looked at her. Torres died, he said quietly. 2017. But his kid is 12 now. And he deserves to know that his father's team came home because someone did what needed to be done, and that someone wasn't a ghost. The words settled in the room like the last thing needed to complete a structure that had been missing its final piece for 15 years. At 2,300 hours, Commander Reyes placed a call to Naval Special Warfare Command. She spoke to the duty officer and requested that Captain Roland Keene be restricted to the installation and available for contact first thing in the morning. She used the specific language of someone who has done this before and knows that the language matters: clear, formal, and carrying the particular gravity of a legal process that has already decided its direction. The duty officer asked for clarification on the nature of the inquiry. Reyes said procurement fraud, falsification of an official after-action report, and conduct related to the compromise of an active rescue operation. She paused. Tell him Commander Reyes from JAG sends her regards. She ended the call. In his quarters at Naval Special Warfare Command, Keene received the duty officer's message at 2,318. He read it twice. He set his phone down. He picked it up and made a call to his lawyer, not to the duty officer. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, he sat in the quiet of his quarters and did the accounting that men do when the thing they've been protecting finally stops being protectable. He had spent 15 years building a career on top of a report that was wrong, and now the report was wrong in 3 independent operator counts and a raw communications archive and a journal that had been sitting in a chest pocket for 15 years waiting for exactly this moment. He did not sleep that night. The next morning arrived fast and clear over Red Mesa, the storm having scrubbed the air to a hard transparency that made distances feel more honest than they usually did. Mara was up before sunrise. She had slept 4 hours in the range facility's dormitory and woken up already thinking about the mission terrain data, which told Owen, when he found her at the coordination table at 545 with fresh coffee, that she was not in the mode of a person processing emotional resolution. She was in the mode of a person with work to finish. "The model is complete," he said. "You finished it last night. I want to run it again," she said. "With the updated Mediterranean pressure data from this morning. The mission window opens in 36 hours. I want the solution to reflect conditions as close to real time as possible." Owen set the coffee down in front of her. Sat across from her Mara. She looked up. "The model is good." "You know it's good," he held her gaze. "What are you actually doing right now?" She looked at the notebook, at the pen in her hand, at the graph paper with the completed solution that she was theoretically improving but actually just touching. "Mutt, I don't know what comes after this," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in that building, and it surprised her slightly to hear herself say it. Owen wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Monroe is going to offer you something this morning. Reinstatement. Some form of official recognition, probably a promotion recommendation." He paused. "What do you want?" "I want the mission to succeed," she said immediately. After that, she was quiet for a moment. The desert outside the window was doing its early morning thing, cool and still, before the day's heat built, before the thermal layers stacked and shifted and created the kind of atmospheric complexity that she could read better than any system the Navy currently owned. "I want it to not happen again," she said finally. "To someone else. Someone who knows what they're seeing and can't get anyone to look." She paused. The system didn't fail because the computer was wrong. The computer was wrong because someone deliberately broke it. But there are people in that system who've been told their data doesn't count because of what they look like or where they came from or what their rank is, and nobody broke anything. The system just decided not to listen. She looked at Owen. "That's what I want to fix, the structural version. Not just the keen version." Owen was quiet for a moment. "It's a bigger project than a single morning at Red Mesa." "Yes," she said. "It is." Maddox came in at 630. He had clearly been awake for a while, and he had clearly been thinking, because he came in with the specific purposefulness of a man who has worked something out overnight and arrived ready to present it. Sat down, he looked at Mara, he looked at Owen. He put his hands on the table. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," he said to Mara. "About respect arriving only after the miracle." She waited. "You're right," he said. "And I've been thinking about why it happens. Why someone walks onto a firing line, any firing line, any discipline, and the room decides before they open their mouth what that person is capable of." He paused. "It's not because the room is full of bad people. It's because the room has been taught to read certain signals and discount others. Rank, title, equipment, gender, age. And the system reinforces it because the system was built by people who already had those signals and never had to question what they were reading." Luis had come in during this. Stood at the edge of the room, coffee in hand, listening. "So, what do you do with that?" Owen said. "You build something different," Maddox said. He looked at Mara. "That's what I've been thinking about. Not apology, as a practical matter. You change the room." He paused. "What would it take to build a training program, not just marksmanship? The full methodology, atmospheric analysis, manual solutions, cross-discipline integration. Something that puts engineers and meteorologists and support personnel on the same line as operators and makes everyone run the same problem." Mara looked at him. She was reading him not with a weather meter, but with the same precision, checking for the defensive shell that official apologies develop. The performance of change that doesn't actually change anything. She didn't find it. "It would take a senior operator willing to put their name on it," she said. "Someone with credibility in the community who would stand up in front of a room of people who think they already know what they need to know and say, 'I was wrong, and here's the proof, and here's what we're doing about it.' I'll do that," Maddox said. "It would take a facility that doesn't close the door on incomplete personnel files," she said. "On sealed records, on people who don't fit the standard template." "Monroe will back that," Maddox said. "I'll make sure he does." "It would take someone willing to be the first student," she said. "Not the instructor, the student. Someone who already has a full career, who sits down next to a 23-year-old meteorologist and says, 'Teach me what you know.'" Maddox held her gaze. "I'll be the first student," he said. "Luis Camacho." From the doorway said, "I want in." Danny Holt appeared behind him. Name. Owen Reddick looked at his journal on the table. He picked it up, held it for a moment, and set it back down. "Someone needs to teach the methods that Phantom Glass developed," he said. "That program knew things that haven't been passed on. It would be a shame to let them stay buried, just because the program was." Mara looked at the table. At all of it, the people around it, the notebook, the graph paper, the cold coffee, the morning coming in through the window with its hard desert clarity. "All right," she said. Monroe arrived at 745. He came in without preamble, looked at the group assembled around the coordination table, sat down. "Keene has been formally restricted," he said. "Reyes is conducting the inquiry. His clearances are suspended pending review." He paused. "He has retained counsel. He will not be making statements to JAG without them present." He looked at Mara. "Which means this moves at the speed of a formal proceeding. Weeks, possibly months, before the record is officially corrected." "I understand," she said. "What I can do now today is open your service record for administrative review. I can flag the Coast After Action report as disputed and under investigation. And I can formally document this morning's and yesterday's range results as part of your professional record." He paused. "It's not reinstatement, but it's the beginning of what reinstatement requires." "That's fine," she said. Monroe looked at her steadily. "I also want to offer you a formal position. Not ceremonial. Operational. A role in the mission data verification process for Far Horizon. Credentialed member of the operational support team." He paused. "With the understanding that if the North Africa mission succeeds using your atmospheric model, that outcome becomes part of the formal record, and if it fails," she said, "then we figure out why and we fix it," Monroe said. "That's also part of the record." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I'll take the position." Monroe nodded. He turned to Maddox. "Your team departs for the forward coordination point in 18 hours. The mission window opens in 36, the model doctor. Voss completed last night has been transmitted to the operational team." He paused. "Is your team ready?" Maddox thought about the question honestly, which was visible on his face. He thought about yesterday morning 13 operators who couldn't hit a target because their data was wrong, and who spent 3 hours being certain that the problem was somewhere else. He thought about what it meant to be ready and what it meant to be certain you were ready, and the gap between those two things. "We're more ready than we were yesterday," he said, "and I think that's actually the more accurate answer." Monroe almost smiled. "It is." He stood. He looked at the room at Maddox, at Owen, at Luis and Danny, at the people who'd filtered in during the morning and were now standing at the edges of the coordination room, which was almost everyone on the team. He looked last at Mara. "Dr. Voss," he said, "for what it's worth, what you did on this range yesterday is going into my personal report as one of the most significant demonstrations of professional competence I've observed in 30 years of naval service." He paused. "It should have been recognized a long time ago." "It's recognized now," she said. "That's enough to work with." The room was quiet after Monroe left. The kind of quiet that follows something significant and needs a moment before the next thing begins. It was Danny Holt who broke it. He walked to the table, picked up the completed atmospheric model and looked at it. "Can I ask you something?" he said to Mara. "Yes. When you fired yesterday the second shot, in the storm window, the 20-second alignment, you recalculated the whole solution in real time." He set the paper down. "What happens if you'd been wrong? If the layers hadn't aligned the way you calculated?" Mara looked at him. "Then I'd have missed. And we'd have figured out why. And fixed it." She picked up her pen. "That's the job. You don't not try because you might be wrong. You try with everything you have. And when you're wrong, you understand it well enough to be less wrong next time." Danny thought about that. "That's not how we usually talk about it," he said. "In sniper school, it's always about certainty. The shot you take because you're certain. You're certain because you've done the work," she said. "But the work includes being wrong and learning from it. The certainty isn't about never missing. It's about understanding the problem well enough that when you miss, know exactly why." She paused. Keene's mistake wasn't taking a wrong position. It was never admitting it was wrong and building 15 years of wrong decisions on top of it. Danny nodded slowly. He looked at Luis. Luis was looking at the table. Owen was watching Mara. He had been watching her for most of the morning with the expression of a man assembling a picture that had been missing pieces for 15 years, and he had most of the pieces now, and what the picture showed him was not what he'd expected, not a tragic figure, not a cautionary tale, not even primarily a story about injustice. It was a story about someone who had decided what mattered and done it anyway, with whatever she had access to for 15 years. "Daniel," he said quietly. Just the name. He'd read it in the briefing materials that Monroe had included the name of her spotter, her husband. He knew, Owen said. What you'd given up, he knew. Yes, she said, he always knew. Was he okay with it? She was quiet for a moment. He said if I spent the rest of my career angry about what Keene took from me, then Keene had taken more than just the qualification. She paused. He said, do the work that's in front of you, make it count. She looked at the notebook. He was right, he was almost always right. Owen nodded once. He picked up his journal, he put it in his vest pocket. He had been carrying it for 15 years and he would probably carry it for the rest of his life, not as evidence anymore, but as something else. As the record of a night when it mattered that someone was in a position nobody acknowledged, doing a job nobody would write down, keeping people alive in the dark. At 1100, the formal inquiry documents from Commander Reyes arrived for Monroe's signature. At 1330, Keene's lawyer made contact with the JAG office and confirmed that his client would not be making a statement. At 1500, the mission package including Mara's verified atmospheric model, Owen's journal, the raw communications transcript with the PG-7 call sign, and the 3 independent operator accounts from Garza, Whitfield, and Reddick was transmitted to the Naval Special Warfare Command Inspector General. Keene's career did not end with a dramatic confrontation. It ended with paperwork, the way most careers end when they reach their point of accountability, forms submitted, clearances suspended, a meeting with lawyers, a day of silence that said everything. The 15-year structure he'd built collapsed not under the weight of accusation, but under the weight of evidence that had been quietly accumulating in journals and archives and notebooks and the memories of men who never forgot a ridge in eastern Afghanistan. Drain cooperated fully. Meridian Systems placed him on administrative leave within 24 hours of the news reaching their legal department. In the coordination room at Red Mesa, late in the afternoon of the day after the exercise, Maddox sat alone at the table for a while. The rest of the team was prepping for departure. Owen was checking his equipment. Luis was running final calculations. Danny Holt was somewhere building the kind of competence he'd seen demonstrated and had decided to spend the next 10 years developing. Maddox sat with a blank range log in front of him. He had started a new one, not the official exercise record, but his own Owen kept. The kind that held what actually happened, not just what was convenient to say happened. He wrote the date. He wrote the location. He wrote the names of everyone present. Then he wrote she was right before the first shot. We were wrong to need the proof. He looked at it. Then he wrote, that's the thing to fix, not just here, everywhere. Close the log. He put it in his vest pocket. He stood up and went to find his team. Because there was a mission, and 12 people in a compound outside Tripoli were waiting on data that was finally, for the first time that week, completely true. And in the secondary equipment room at the far end of the range building, the gray composite case sat on the bench where Owen had left it the night before. Phantom glass rifle inside it was cleaned and secured. Scope zeroed, the worn stock bearing its small engraved symbol, the compass bisected by lightning visible in the low light of the room. Nobody had put it back in storage. Nobody had filed the paperwork to return it to inventory. It sat there like a question that had been asked and answered, waiting to find out what happened next. The team departed Red Mesa at 400. 13 operators, full mission load, the kind of quiet that exists in vehicles before something real begins. Maddox front again, same seat, same window, same desert, turning from black to rust orange as the sun climbed. But the truck felt different from the one he'd ridden into Red Mesa 2 days earlier. Not physically. Something in the atmosphere of it. The way the men sat, the quality of the silence. Luis Camacho was running calculations in his notebook. Not on a device in a notebook by hand the way Mara had shown him. He'd been doing it since 330, sitting in the facility common room while the rest of the team prepped, working through the atmospheric model layer by layer until he understood not just the answer but the architecture of how the answer was built. Danny Holt had Mara's graph paper folded in his vest pocket. He hadn't asked her for it. She had handed it to him when the team was loading out, without explanation, and he had taken it the same way without explanation, because some things don't need one. Owen Reddick was asleep in the back seat within 4 minutes of the convoy departing. He was the only one who slept. He had learned decades ago that sleep before a mission was not rest, it was maintenance, and maintenance was professional responsibility. He slept with his journal in his vest pocket and his spotting scope case between his knees, and the expression of a man who has resolved something that needed resolving and can now be fully present for what comes next. Mara was not in the convoy. She was in the air, a separate transport. Mission support personnel, flying toward the forward coordination point where the operational team had been staged for 6 days waiting on verified data. The atmospheric model she'd completed at Red Mesa had been transmitted ahead. The team on the ground had been working from it for 12 hours already, adjusting their approach vectors, identifying the terrain features she'd flagged, running the infiltration route against the thermal and wind data she'd mapped from Mediterranean coast station readings. When she landed, the team's senior planner, a compact, serious Navy commander named Elise Park, was waiting at the tarmac. Park had been running hostage rescue operations for 11 years. She shook Mara's hand and said, "Your model identified a thermal channel through the northern approach that our satellite data completely missed. We've been flying drones through the wrong corridor for a week," Mara said. "How long have you been working the northern route?" 12 hours. Is it viable? It's better than viable." Park looked at her steadily. "Where did you develop this methodology?" "Field research," Mara said. "And practical experience." Park held her gaze for a moment. Then she almost smiled. "Right, come inside. We have 30 hours before the window opens, and I want you in the room when we finalize the infiltration profile." The next 30 hours were the most concentrated work of a kind that Mara had spent 15 years training herself to do, and never expected to be doing at this level again. The operational planning room was tight, functional, and occupied by people who were very good at their jobs and knew it without making it a personality. She fit into it the way she'd fit into every professional environment she'd occupied in 15 years of civilian research, by being useful, by knowing her subject, by not making it about anything other than the problem in front of her. Park introduced her to the room as our atmospheric specialist from Red Mesa. No elaboration. No history. The room didn't need history, it needed accurate data. And Mara provided it in the same handwritten, layered, terrain-specific format that had put a round through a steel panel at nearly 4,000 meters in a New Mexico desert. The mission planner working the infiltration route, a young lieutenant named Garrett, pushed back on the northern thermal channel within the first hour. He was not being difficult. He was doing his job, which was to test every assumption before it became a decision that people's lives depended on. "The channel you've identified runs between two ridge features," he said. "If the thermal behavior shifts after insertion, the extraction team is committed to a route that could become a wind tunnel. We lose the approach advantage." "The thermal is stable between 200 and 430, Mara said. "It's driven by the temperature differential between the coast and the inland plateau. That differential doesn't vary significantly in this season." She opened her notebook. "I've modeled it against 3 years of coastal station data. The variance is less than 8% across the full window." 8% is a real number at the margins," Garrett said. "Yes," she said. 8% at the margins means the outer edge of the channel is variable. The core is stable." She turned the notebook toward him. "I've flagged the stable core on the terrain map. That's the route, not the channel. The core of the channel." Garrett looked at it. He was quiet for a moment. "How do you verify a thermal core in real time?" "In the field, dust behavior at ground level," she said. "At the insertion point, there's a dry wash running east to west. If the core is active, the dust in that wash will be running consistently westward. If it's running variable, you're in the margin. You hold and reassess." She paused. "I can give your point element a field protocol for reading it on the ground." Garrett looked at Park. Park looked at Mara. "Give him the protocol," Park said. Mara spent the next 2 hours building a field-readable version of her atmospheric assessment, a simple, practical guide that an operator on the ground could use to verify conditions before committing to the infiltration route. No computers, no instruments beyond what they were already carrying. Just observations, specific and teachable, applied to what was actually there. When she handed it to Garrett, he read it twice and said, "My sniper school instructors never taught anything like this." "I know," she said. He looked up. "Did yours?" She held his gaze for a moment. "Once," she said. "A long time ago, at 300 on the day of the mission." Maddox's team reached the forward coordination point. They had driven through the night and arrived with the particular compressed alertness of operators who are past tired and have gone through it to the other side, the clean, functional state that the body produces when it understands that rest is no longer an option and efficiency is the only mode available. Maddox came into the planning room, saw the model on the table, saw Mara beside it, and said nothing for a moment. He looked at the infiltration route. He looked at the field protocol for thermal verification. He picked it up and read it. "This is good," he said. "Thank you," she said. "I mean, it's genuinely operationally good." He set it down. "Garrett told me he's been running his team through the observation protocol for the last 2 hours. They can execute it." "I know," she said. "I watched them practice it." He looked at her. "You watched them." "I wanted to make sure they understood it well enough to use it under pressure. There's a difference between being able to read it on paper and being able to apply it at 300 in a dry wash in the dark." She paused. "They understand it." Maddox picked up the protocol sheet again. He was looking at the observation criteria, the specific field indicators, the dust behavior benchmarks, the decision points. It was precise and it was practical, and it was written in the language of people who needed to use it, rather than in the language of people who had written it to demonstrate expertise. "Told Monroe I'd be the first student," he said. "When this is over, when the mission is done, and we're back in the room, I meant that." "I know you did," she said. "I need you to hold me to it," he said. "Not as a courtesy. As a professional commitment. If I start building the program and I start reverting, if the old habits come back and I stop listening to the people who aren't holding the rank I'm used to, respecting, I need someone in the room who will call it." She looked at him steadily. "That's not a small thing to ask." "No, it isn't all right," she said. "I'll call it." He nodded once. Set the protocol sheet down, he went to find his team. The mission launched at 247. Mara was in the coordination room, with Park and the command element, tracking the infiltration in real time through the communication feed. She was also tracking the atmospheric data, not because anyone had asked her to, but because it was the only useful thing she could do from where she was, and useful was the only mode she had ever known how to operate in. The point element hit the dry wash at 318 30 seconds of radio silence. In the team leader's voice, quiet and certain, dust running west. Consistent. "We're in the core." Park looked at Mara across the table. Mara was already marking the time in her notebook. "They're good," Mara said. "They were good." The infiltration ran clean through the thermal channel. The team moving through terrain that the corrupted satellite data had flagged as high exposure, and that Mara's model had correctly identified as covered and approach viable. The northern route that everyone had been ignoring for 6 days was, as it turned out, the right route. The satellite model had been measuring the wrong layer, not because someone had sabotaged it, but because it had been built on standard parameters that didn't account for the coastal plateau differential that Mara had spent 2 days of analysis identifying. Nobody had broken that system. It had just been wrong, in the way that systems are wrong when they're built on assumptions that haven't been tested against what's actually there. At 401, the team reached the compound perimeter. At 423, 12 American civilians were moving through the northern extraction corridor. At 511, all 12 cleared the final checkpoint. No operators lost. No hostages lost. A mission that had been 48 hours from being redesigned around corrupted data, carried to completion on a verified atmospheric model built in a coordination room in New Mexico by a woman with a handwritten notebook and 15 years of work that was finally, unambiguously, in the official record. Park stood up from the command table when the final clearance call came through. She looked at the team around her. She looked at Mara. She said, "That's 12. She said it quietly, the way people say the things that actually matter. Mara wrote the time in her notebook. She closed it. She set her pen down. She sat for a moment in the coordination room, in the particular stillness that follows something completed, not the loud relief of a crisis resolved, but the quiet of a weight that has been set down after a long walk, the body taking a moment to understand that it no longer has to hold that particular thing. 12 people were out. The mission data had been accurate. The thermal channel had been exactly where she said it would be. The core had been stable for the full infiltration window. He thought about Daniel. Not in a dramatic way, just the ordinary, present way that people think about the people they've loved when something good happens, and that person isn't there to hear about it. He would have said, "I told you the work was worth doing." He would have said it with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who had always known something that the world needed a while longer to figure out. She pulled out her phone. She looked at his photograph for a moment, not the one from the service, the formal one, but the one from a weekend in the mountains 3 years before he died, where he was laughing at something she'd said, and the light was doing something good with the afternoon. She looked at it for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she put the phone away. She stood up. She picked up her notebook. She went back to work. 6 weeks later, Red Mesa Naval Test Range held its first session of a program that did not yet have an official name. Monroe had approved the framework. Maddox had drafted the structure. Mara had written the methodology. And what assembled on that firing line at 800 on a Tuesday morning in October was unlike anything that firing line had seen before, not in terms of the weapons or the equipment, but in terms of who was standing behind the line. 13 operators. 3 atmospheric scientists, 2 engineers from the Naval Surface Warfare Center, 1 meteorologist who was 24 years old and had never fired a military rifle in her life, 1 retired master sergeant from the Army who had spent 22 years doing long-range reconnaissance and had been told twice by Navy procurement that his methodology was outdated, and once by an Air Force colonel that his numbers were too conservative to be useful. and one former DARPA researcher who was 61 years old and had been quietly building atmospheric models for systems he never saw deployed, from an office in Virginia for 11 years. Maddox stood at the front of the line. He had the range log under his arm. He had no prepared remarks, because he had decided that the day the program started should not begin with prepared remarks. It should begin with honesty. "I'll tell you what this program isn't," he said. "It isn't a ceremony, it isn't a gesture, it isn't the Navy acknowledging a mistake and putting a bow on it." He paused. 3 months ago on this range, I dismissed someone's expertise because of what she was wearing and what she was holding and what her rank insignia said. He looked at the line of people in front of him, operators and scientists and engineers, and one 24-year-old meteorologist who was listening with the focused attention of someone who has never been invited into this kind of room before and intends to make the most of every second of it. "I was wrong, and the specific way I was wrong cost us 3 hours of an exercise that 12 people's lives depended on." He paused again. "This program exists because being wrong in that specific way, in that specific situation, is a form of operational failure. And we don't accept operational failure because it's comfortable." He looked at Mara, who was standing at the far end of the line. "Dr. Voss is the program director," he said. "That means when she speaks, you listen. Not because I'm telling you to. Because she has earned it 15 times over in ways that this range's record now reflects." He held her gaze across the line. "And I am the first enrolled student, not the instructor." Student. He walked to the line and stood in it between Luis Camacho and the 24-year-old meteorologist, whose name was Specialist Ana Reyes, no relation to Commander Diane Reyes, and who had flown from a weather station in Pensacola because Monroe's office had called her supervisor and said they needed someone who could read a coastal plateau atmospheric differential and explain it to a room full of people who were accustomed to being the most capable person present. Ana Reyes had brought a notebook. Mara walked to the front of the line. She looked at the range, the familiar 4,000 meters of New Mexico hardpan, the distant steel panel, the desert air already building its morning layers. She looked at the people in front of her. The operators with their 19 years of combined excellence, the scientists with their data and their methods, the engineer who had built 3 targeting systems and never stood behind a rifle in the field, the meteorologist who could read the sky with a precision that none of the operators could match and knew almost nothing about what happened to a round in flight. "We're going to start with the atmosphere," she said. "Not the shot, the atmosphere. Because the shot is the last thing. The shot is where everything else you've done either holds together or falls apart." She opened her notebook. "And what I've learned is that most people, regardless of their expertise, regardless of their experience, are measuring the wrong layer. They're getting accurate data on something that isn't the actual problem." Ana Reyes, 24 years old, who had never been in a room like this before, raised her hand. "Yes," Mara said. "How do you know which layer is the actual problem?" "You watch," Mara said. "You look at what's actually moving, not what the instrument says should be moving." "What's actually moving?" She paused. "It sounds simple. It isn't. It takes a long time to unlearn the habit of trusting the instrument more than what you can see." Ana wrote that down, word for word. The retired Army Master Sergeant, whose name was Earl Crockett, and who had been told twice that his methodology was outdated, said from his end of the line, "That's the same problem in every field I've ever worked in. You build a system to measure the thing, and then you start trusting the system more than the thing." "Yes," Mara said. "Exactly that." Crockett looked at Maddox. "This is going to be a good program," he said. Maddox looked down the line at all of them. "It better be," he said. "I drove 6 hours to be a student for the first time in 20 years. I'd like it to be worth the drive," Luis Camacho said. "From his position, you drove 5 hours. You were speeding." Danny Holt laughed. Owen Reddick, who was standing at the far end of the line with his spotting scope over his shoulder, made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same family. And for a moment, just a moment, the firing line at Red Mesa held something that firing lines don't usually hold. Not the tension of competition, not the pressure of performance, not the managed authority of rank sorting people into their assigned positions. Just a group of people who had arrived with different skills and different histories and a shared problem that none of them could solve alone, standing in the New Mexico morning with the desert air building its layers around them. Then Mara said, "All right, let's begin." The formal inquiry into Roland Keene concluded 11 weeks after the exercise at Red Mesa. Commander Reyes presented findings to the Naval Inspector General that documented, in precise legal language, the falsification of the Coast After Action Report, the procurement fraud related to Meridian Systems, the unauthorized modification of the Red Mesa sensor array, and the deliberate suppression of Lieutenant Mara Ellison's service record and qualification. Did not contest the findings. His lawyer presented a statement on his behalf that used the word regret 4 times and the word accountability twice and contained nothing that amounted to a genuine acknowledgement of what the findings actually described. The Inspector General's office noted the statement for the record and proceeded with its recommendations. Keene was stripped of his rank, his pension reduced, and the Coast After Action report officially revised to reflect what Owen Reddick's journal, Garzah's testimony, Whitfield's testimony, and the Raw Communications Archive had always shown. The revised report named the shooter on the Eastern Ridge. It named her by her call sign, first PG-7, and then by her full name and rank, Lieutenant Mara Ellison, Phantom Glass 7 Ridge, Coast Province. 22 minutes under active contact. Traction team of 9 brought out intact. The revision was not front-page news. It didn't generate a press release or a ceremony. It was a document correction, processed through the administrative channel, added to the official record with the quiet permanence of things that are finally true. Owen Reddick received a copy. He read it once, standing at his kitchen table, and then he put it in a drawer beside his journal. He did not call anyone. He did not make a thing of it. He just stood there for a moment in the kitchen with the specific quality of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally, formally been permitted to set it down. He made himself coffee. He went to work. Mara received her copy on a Tuesday afternoon in the coordination office at Red Mesa, where the program had been running for 3 weeks and where she'd spent most of those 3 weeks doing exactly what she'd told Monroe she wanted to do, building something structural, something that addressed the problem at its root rather than its surface. She read the revised report. She read her name in the official record. She read the 22 minutes acknowledged, the team of 9, the operational outcome that had been buried for 15 years and was now simply, finally, part of what had happened. She folded the document. She put it in her notebook between the pages of the Tripoli atmospheric model and the field protocol she'd written for Garrett's team. Closed the notebook. She had a session in 40 minutes. Mona Reyes was presenting her analysis of the morning's low-altitude wind data to the full group, and Maddox had asked for an extra 30 minutes of session time because he was still working through the second layer of the manual calculation protocol and wanted to do it in front of the group rather than privately, which was exactly the kind of thing Mara had asked him to do when she said he needed to be a student rather than an instructor. She picked up her notebook. She walked down the hall to the coordination room. She opened the door. 14 people looked up. Ana Reyes was at the front of the room, her own notebook open, her morning data written in the precise shorthand of someone who had been doing this kind of documentation for years and was now, for the first time, being asked to present it to a room that was genuinely interested. Maddox was in the middle of the room. He had a range card and a pencil. He had made 3 calculation errors in the morning session and had corrected each of them without defense, which had produced more learning in the room than the correct calculations would have. Crockett was in the back row with his arms crossed, which was how he looked when he was most engaged. Danny Holt had his notebook open to a page that was completely full. It started a second. Luis was at the whiteboard, working through a wind layer diagram that he'd started building to explain something to the engineer from surface warfare and had not yet finished because the engineer kept asking questions that complicated it in useful. Mara walked to the front of the room. She stood beside Ana Reyes, looked at her with the expression of someone who is about to present something they worked hard on and is not entirely sure of the room. Ready, Mara said. I think so, Ana said. You are, Mara said. I've seen your data. Present it the way you prepared it. Ana straightened. She looked at the room. She began. She was good. She was very good, precise, clear, and certain enough in her expertise that the room's attention organized around her, the way attention organizes around someone who actually knows what they're talking about. Maddox listened with the focused openness of a man who has committed to learning something new and is far enough into the commitment that the discomfort has become familiar. Crockett uncrossed his arms. The engineer stopped taking notes and just listened, which was how he showed respect. When Ana finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Maddox said, "Run me through the second layer again, the part about the low-altitude inversion. I want to understand it at the application level, not just the conceptual level." Ana ran him through it again. He asked 2 more questions. She answered both, and on the second answer she caught something she'd missed in the original presentation and corrected it in real time, calmly, without apology, the way competent people correct things when they're focused on getting it right, rather than on appearing right. Marka watched this and thought, this is what it looks like. This is the room. Not the dramatic reveal, not the impossible shot that silences the crowd, not the formal document correction, or the inquiry findings, or the revised record. This 14 people in a coordination room on a Tuesday morning, a 24-year-old meteorologist presenting her data to operators who are genuinely listening, senior chief who drove 5 hours and is sitting in the student's chair and asking the questions he doesn't know the answers to. This was the thing worth building. 3 months after the program's first session, Mark drove to the cemetery where Daniel was buried. She went on a Thursday, which was not an anniversary of anything. She just went because she had something she wanted to tell him, and she had learned a long time ago that waiting for the significant date was a way of delaying the conversation. She stood at his grave. She had the spent casing from the Red Mesa shot in her jacket pocket, the verification shot, the second one, the one taken in the storm window, with the 20-second alignment and the completely recalculated solution. She had kept it for this. She set it beside his service photograph. Said the record is corrected. 12 people came home. Program is running. She paused. You were right about the work. You were always right about the work. She stood there for a moment in the quiet. The wind was doing something with the cemetery trees, a low, steady movement that she tracked automatically, the way she always tracked moving air, out of a habit so deep it had become simply the way she perceived the world. I'm not angry anymore, she said. I think I was angrier than I knew for a long time. And I think I turned it into the work, which was the right thing to do with it. But I'm not angry anymore, she paused. I'm just here. Doing the job that's in front of me. She stayed for a while. Not just long enough. She drove back to Red Mesa. She had a session the next morning, a new group, the second cohort of the program, which Monroe had expanded after the Tripoli mission outcome reached the right desks. This cohort included 2 people Mara had specifically requested, a female communications specialist who had been submitting methodology recommendations to her unit's operational chain for 2 years without response, and a retired Navy warrant officer who had developed an atmospheric modeling approach for naval gunnery that the procurement office had declined to review because it came from a non-commissioned source. She had read their work. Both of them were right. Both of them had been telling someone who wasn't listening. She was going to put them in the room where people listened. On the last morning of the program's first full cycle, the firing line at Red Mesa assembled at dawn. 14 people, the original cohort operators and scientists and engineers, and one 24-year-old meteorologist and one retired Army Master Sergeant who had been told twice that his methods were outdated. Maddox handed Mara the range log. It had been his job to maintain it for the full session cycle, which was an unusual assignment for a senior chief, but he had asked for it specifically. He had logged every session, every calculation error, every question asked, and every answer given. Every moment when someone in the room knew something that someone else needed, and the room made space for the transfer. Where do we begin today, he said. Mara took the range log. She looked at the desert. The air was doing its morning thing, cool building, the low layer just beginning to organize itself before the day's heat complicated everything. She could read it from where she stood. She had been reading air like this for 30 years, in programs that officially didn't exist, and civilian posts that officially weren't enough, and an impossible shot that became, in the end, simply the beginning of the work that actually mattered. With the atmosphere, she said. Same as every morning. She opened the log. Because the shot is always last, and everything before it is either right or it isn't. She turned to the line. 14 people looked back at her. Operators who had unlearned certainty. Scientists who had learned to present their expertise to rooms that had never thought to listen. An engineer who now carried a field notebook alongside his technical manuals. Meteorologist who had walked into the most intimidating professional space of her young career and found that her knowledge was not just welcome but essential. An old soldier who had been right for 20 years and was finally in a room where being right was the whole point. And a senior chief who had driven 5 hours to be a student and had been one honestly and completely every day since. None of them could see the whole wind alone. That was the first thing she had told them. It was also the last thing and the thing in between, and the only thing that had ever mattered in any of it. She raised her pen. Let's begin, she said, and that was enough. That was exactly enough, because the real mission had never been the 4,000-meter shot. It had been this. The morning, the people, the room where the right voices were finally permanently heard.